They say tragedy changes people, but nobody could have predicted how completely it would transform Richard Ashford from the warm-hearted man he once was into the cold, unfeeling CEO who now ruled Ashford Industries with an iron fist. This is a story about loss, redemption, and the unexpected person who brought light back into a life consumed by darkness. Before we dive in, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We love hearing from our viewers around the world. And if you enjoy stories that touch the heart and surprise you until the very end, don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss our next incredible tale. The elevator doors opened on the 42nd floor of the Ashford Tower in downtown Manhattan, and Richard Ashford stepped out precisely at 7:30 a.m., just as he had every weekday for the past 10 years. The employees who happened to be in the lobby immediately fell silent, their conversations dying mid-sentence as they watched him stride past. Nobody dared to greet him. Nobody smiled in his direction. They simply watched with a mixture of fear and respect as the 52-year-old CEO made his way to his corner office, his Italian leather shoes clicking against the marble floor with mechanical precision. Richard Ashford was a legend in the corporate world, and not necessarily for good reasons. While his business acumen was unquestionable, he had tripled his company's value in the last decade. His reputation as the most cold-hearted executive in New York was equally undisputed. His employees called him the Ice King behind his back, though never within earshot. Stories circulated about his ruthlessness. The executive fired on Christmas Eve, the charity event he had shut down because it interfered with quarterly reports, the time he had terminated an entire department via email without a single word of explanation. But what truly set Richard apart wasn't just his harsh business practices. It was his complete absence of emotion. In 10 years, not a single person had seen him smile, laugh, or show even the faintest flicker of warmth. His face remained eternally set in an expression of stern disapproval, his voice never rising above or falling below the same monotone delivery. Board meetings were exercises in endurance, with Richard dismantling presentations and crushing dreams with the same clinical detachment a surgeon might show while removing an appendix. The 42nd floor was Richard's domain, and it reflected his personality perfectly. Everything was pristine, minimalist, and devoid of personal touches. The walls were painted a sterile white, the furniture was sleek and uncomfortable, and the temperature was kept at a constant 65 degrees, cold enough that most employees wore sweaters even in summer. The only decoration in Richard's office was a single photograph, face down on his desk, never displayed but never discarded. On this particular Tuesday morning in October, the New York skyline was barely visible through a thick blanket of fog that had rolled in from the harbor. The weather matched Richard's mood perfectly, which was to say, it was grim and uninviting. He settled into his chair, opened his laptop, and began reviewing the quarterly reports with the same intensity he brought to everything he did. At 8 o'clock sharp, his assistant Jennifer knocked timidly on his door. She had been with the company for 3 years, longer than most who worked directly with Richard. She had learned to survive by being absolutely perfect in her duties and never, ever attempting casual conversation. "Mr. Ashford, the morning briefings are ready," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Leave them on the desk," Richard replied without looking up. Jennifer placed the folder down with trembling hands and retreated quickly, grateful to have escaped another interaction unscathed. Richard didn't notice her nervousness. He barely noticed Jennifer at all, just as he barely noticed most people. They were simply elements in his well-ordered world, no more significant than the furniture or the coffee machine that delivered his espresso at precisely 8:15 every morning. What Richard didn't know was that his perfectly controlled world was about to be disrupted by the most unlikely person imaginable. Marcus Webb was 63 years old and had been working as a janitor at Ashford Tower for just over 2 months. He had the kind of face that made people immediately trust him, warm brown eyes that crinkled at the corners, a salt and pepper beard kept neatly trimmed, and a smile that seemed perpetually ready to break free. Before taking the janitorial job, Marcus had lived a full life, 20 years as a high school music teacher, a brief stint as a jazz pianist in New Orleans, and more recently, a string of odd jobs after his pension had proven insufficient for New York's brutal cost of living. Unlike most of the building staff, Marcus worked the evening and night shifts, usually arriving around 6 p.m. and finishing around 2 a.m. This meant his interactions with Richard Ashford had been minimal, just occasional passing in the hallways when Richard worked late, which was often. Marcus had heard all the stories about the Ice King, but he had learned long ago not to judge people by their reputations. Everyone had a story, he believed, and usually, the coldest exteriors hid the deepest wounds. Marcus's approach to his work was unconventional for a janitor. He didn't just clean. He observed, he listened, and he genuinely cared about the spaces he maintained. He had noticed things about the 42nd floor that others had missed. He had seen the photograph on Richard's desk during one late-night cleaning session, when he thought he was alone. He had found, hidden behind a filing cabinet, a child's drawing of a family, stick figures holding hands under a bright yellow sun, signed, "Love, Emma," in crayon. He had observed the way Richard's office stayed lit, until well past midnight most nights, and how the waste paper basket was often filled with crumpled papers covered in writing that looked more like letters than business correspondence. Marcus had developed a habit during his rounds that had become something of a signature. He would sing quietly while he worked. Old jazz standards, blues tunes, sometimes gospel songs from his childhood in Georgia. His voice was rich and warm, carrying softly through the empty hallways. It helped pass the time and brought him joy in what many would consider a thankless job. One Tuesday evening, about 3 weeks after the foggy October morning, Marcus was making his rounds on the 42nd floor around 9 p.m. He had assumed everyone had gone home, as they usually did by this hour. He was pushing his cleaning cart down the hallway, softly singing "What a Wonderful World" by Louis Armstrong, when he noticed light spilling from Richard Ashford's office. The door was slightly ajar. Marcus hesitated. He knew better than to disturb the CEO, but the floor needed cleaning, and his supervisor had been very clear that every area had to be maintained to perfection. He knocked gently on the door frame. "Mr. Ashford, I can come back later if you're still working," Marcus called out politely. There was a long pause before Richard's voice came back, flat and uninviting. "Enter." Marcus pushed his cart into the office, immediately noticing the exhaustion etched into Richard's face. The man looked like he hadn't slept properly in days, maybe years. His tie was loosened, the first sign of disorder Marcus had ever witnessed in the CEO, and there were dark circles under his eyes that looked almost like bruises. "I'll be quick, sir. Just need to empty the trash and do a quick sweep," Marcus said, maintaining his characteristically cheerful demeanor. Richard didn't respond. He simply returned his attention to his computer screen, his fingers typing with mechanical efficiency. Marcus went about his work quietly, but something made him pause when he reached the waste paper basket. Among the crumpled papers was a greeting card, partially visible. Even upside down, Marcus could read the words, "Happy Birthday," and see what looked like a child's handwriting. Marcus didn't comment, but something shifted in his chest, a deep pang of empathy. He continued cleaning, and as he worked, he began to hum softly, almost unconsciously. The melody was gentle and melancholic. "Moon River." "Stop that," Richard said suddenly, his voice sharp enough to cut glass. Marcus immediately fell silent. "I apologize, Mr. Ashford. Bad habit of mine." Richard said nothing more, and Marcus finished his work in silence. As he prepared to leave, he paused at the door. Something in his gut told him to say what he was thinking. Consequences be damned. "Mr. Ashford, I don't mean to overstep, but you look like you could use some rest. This building will still be here tomorrow." Richard's head snapped up, his eyes meeting Marcus's for the first time. For just a moment, Marcus saw something flicker in those cold blue eyes. Surprise, perhaps. Or maybe anger, but then the shutters came down again. "My schedule is none of your concern. Don't let it happen again." Marcus nodded and left, but the encounter stayed with him. There was something about Richard Ashford that reminded him of students he had known over the years, kids who had built walls so high and so thick that they had forgotten how to let anyone in. Usually, those were the kids who needed help the most. Over the next few weeks, Marcus made a point of cleaning Richard's office at times when he knew the CEO would be there. Richard never acknowledged his presence beyond curt commands or irritated glances, but Marcus persisted. He would make small talk that went unanswered, offer observations about the weather that were met with silence, and occasionally hum tunes that were immediately shut down. But Marcus was patient. Patience, after all, was something he had learned from decades of teaching teenagers. Then came the evening that changed everything. It was late November, and an early winter storm had blanketed Manhattan in snow. The city looked almost magical from the 42nd floor, with snowflakes swirling past the windows like tiny dancers. Marcus arrived for his shift to find that many of the evening workers had left early to beat the storm. The building was quieter than usual, almost eerily so. When Marcus reached the executive floor around 10 p.m., he found Richard still in his office, but something was different. The man wasn't working. He was sitting in his chair, turned toward the window, completely still. On his desk, clearly visible now, was the photograph that was usually face down. Even from the doorway, Marcus could see it showed a beautiful woman with dark hair and a little girl with blonde pigtails, both smiling radiantly at the camera. Marcus knocked softly, but Richard didn't respond. Concerned, Marcus entered the office. "Mr. Ashford, sir, are you all right?" Still no response. As Marcus got closer, he could see Richard's face reflected in the window. The man looked utterly devastated. His jaw clenched so tight the muscles stood out, his eyes fixed on something far beyond the snowy cityscape. In his hand, he clutched the birthday card Marcus had seen weeks ago. Marcus had seen this look before, on the faces of students who had lost parents, on friends who had buried loved ones. This was the face of grief so profound, it had petrified into something harder than stone. Without thinking it through, Marcus did something that would have shocked anyone who knew Richard Ashford. He walked around the desk, pulled up a chair, and sat down next to the CEO. Not across from him, not at a respectful distance, but right beside him, close enough to be present, far enough to not be threatening. "Today's a hard day, isn't it?" Marcus said quietly. For a long moment, Richard didn't move. Then, almost imperceptibly, he nodded. "Want to talk about it?" Marcus asked. "No." The word came out hoarse, like Richard hadn't used his voice in hours. "That's okay," Marcus said. "We can just sit here if you'd like." They sat in silence for several minutes, the only sound the soft whisper of the heating system and the occasional howl of wind against the windows. Marcus didn't push, didn't pry. He simply existed in the space, offering his presence as the only comfort he could give. Finally, Richard spoke, his voice so quiet Marcus almost didn't hear it. "Today was my daughter's birthday. She would have been 17. The words hung in the air like fragile glass ornaments, ready to shatter at the slightest disturbance. Marcus felt his heart constrict, but he kept his voice steady and gentle. "Emma," Marcus said softly, remembering the signature on the drawing he had found. Richard's head turned sharply. "How did you—" "Found a drawing once, behind the filing cabinet. Didn't mean to intrude. Just happened to see it while cleaning." Marcus paused. She had talent. That son was something special. A sound escaped Richard's throat, not quite a laugh, not quite a sob. Something in between that spoke of years of suppressed emotion trying desperately to break free. "She loved to draw," Richard said, his voice cracking. "Always had a crayon or marker in her hand. Made pictures for everyone. That one," he gestured vaguely toward where Marcus had found the drawing. "That was the last one she made before the accident." Marcus waited, knowing that sometimes the most important thing you could do was listen. "Car accident. 10 years ago this past September. Drunk driver ran a red light. My wife Sarah died on impact." "Emma," Richard's voice broke completely, and he had to stop, taking several shuddering breaths before continuing. "Emma held on for 3 days. She was only 7 years old, and she was so brave, so incredibly brave. She held my hand and told me not to be sad, that she and Mommy would be okay. She made me promise to keep smiling, to keep laughing, to remember all the happy times. She made me promise." Tears were streaming down Richard's face now. The first tears he had allowed himself to shed in front of another human being in a decade. His whole body was shaking with the effort of holding back 10 years of grief. "And then she died, and I couldn't do it. I couldn't smile, couldn't laugh. Every time I tried, all I could think about was that I was here and they weren't. That I got to keep breathing, keep living, and they didn't. So I stopped trying. I stopped feeling anything at all because feeling meant remembering, and remembering meant pain. I built this company, made it successful, told myself that's what I was supposed to do. But the truth is, I've just been existing. For 10 years, I've just been waiting for it to stop hurting." Marcus felt tears prick his own eyes, but he didn't try to hide them. "Does it?" he asked gently. "Does it stop hurting?" Richard let out a bitter, broken laugh. "No. It never stops. You just get better at pretending it doesn't exist." Marcus was quiet for a moment, choosing his next words carefully. "Can I tell you something, Mr. Ashford? Something I learned the hard way?" Richard didn't respond, but he didn't tell Marcus to leave either. 20 years ago, I lost my son. He was 15, leukemia. Fought it for 2 years before his body just couldn't fight anymore." Marcus's voice was steady but thick with old sorrow. "And for a while after, I did exactly what you did. I stopped living, went through the motions, but I wasn't really there. And you know what I realized? By doing that, I was dishonoring his memory. My boy loved life. He loved music, loved laughing, loved making terrible jokes that made everyone groan. And by refusing to feel joy, I was essentially saying that his love of life didn't matter, that all those moments of happiness we shared meant nothing." Richard turned to look at Marcus fully for the first time. really seeing him. Emma didn't ask you to stop feeling, Marcus continued. She asked you to keep smiling. Keep laughing, not because she wanted you to forget, but because she wanted you to remember all the good times, to honor the joy she brought to your life by continuing to find joy in the world she loved so much. I can't, Richard whispered. I don't know how anymore. Sure you can, Marcus said with gentle confidence. It's like riding a bike. You might be rusty, but it'll come back. And you know what? You don't have to do it alone. Nobody should have to carry that kind of weight by themselves. Richard stared at the photograph on his desk, at his wife's smile and Emma's bright, joyful eyes. I don't even remember what my laugh sounds like anymore. Marcus stood up and walked over to his cleaning cart. From a small compartment, he pulled out an old, battered harmonica. Richard watched with confusion as Marcus returned to his seat. This was my son's, Marcus explained, holding the instrument up to the light. He was learning to play before he got sick. Wasn't very good, truth be told, but he loved it anyway. After he died, I couldn't touch it for years, but eventually, I realized that playing it wasn't making me sad. It was making me feel close to him again. Marcus lifted the harmonica to his lips and began to play. The melody was Somewhere Over the Rainbow, but played slowly, with a bluesy, soulful quality that filled the office with unexpected warmth. Richard listened, and something in his chest, something that had been locked tight for a decade, began to crack. When Marcus finished, he lowered the harmonica and smiled. Your daughter sounds like she was a special kid, the kind of kid who would have hated seeing her dad this miserable. Am I right? Despite everything, despite the tears still wet on his face and the grief still crushing his chest, Richard felt the corners of his mouth twitch. It was microscopic, barely noticeable, but it was there. She would have been furious. She hated when anyone was sad. Always trying to cheer people up. Sounds like someone I'd have loved to meet, Marcus said warmly. Tell me about her. What made her laugh? Richard hesitated. He hadn't talked about Emma, really talked about her, in 10 years. Everyone who knew him had learned not to mention her, and he had locked away every memory like treasures too precious and painful to examine. But sitting here, with this janitor who had somehow seen through his walls, Richard found himself wanting to remember. Everything made her laugh, Richard began slowly. She had this giggle that was absolutely infectious. She laughed at my terrible dad jokes, at cartoon characters, at the way her mother danced in the kitchen. She would laugh so hard sometimes she'd get the hiccups. And then she'd laugh even harder because she had the hiccups. Marcus grinned. Bet you she got that sense of humor from you. Maybe, Richard said. And there it was again, that tiny uplift at the corner of his mouth. I used to be different. Before, I used to joke around, play with her, be silly. Sarah always said I was just a big kid myself. What changed after the accident? Marcus asked, though he suspected he knew the answer. Everyone told me to be strong, to focus on work, to keep busy, to move forward, and I thought that meant shutting everything down. I fired anyone who tried to get close, pushed away friends, made myself into this, Richard gestured at himself with disgust, this cold machine, because machines don't feel, machines don't hurt, but they don't live either. Marcus pointed out gently. Richard was quiet for a long moment. No, he finally admitted. They don't. Marcus stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the snowy city. You know what I think? I think your Emma is up there somewhere. Probably pretty frustrated with you right now. I think she's been waiting 10 years for her dad to remember his promise. And I think, he turned back to Richard with a knowing smile, that she sent an old janitor with a harmonica to remind you. Richard wanted to dismiss it as sentimental nonsense, but something about the way Marcus said it, with such genuine warmth and belief, made it impossible to completely reject. That's ridiculous. Maybe, Marcus agreed cheerfully, but you smiled. Just a tiny bit, but you smiled, and that's a start. Richard touched his face, almost surprised to find that Marcus was right. Something in his expression had shifted. It wasn't much, but it was something. I don't know if I can do this, Richard said quietly. I don't know if I can let myself feel again. You don't have to do it all at once, Marcus assured him. Start small. Tomorrow morning, when Jennifer brings your coffee, maybe say, thank you, and actually look at her when you say it. Maybe notice that she's a real person who works hard for you. Little things, Mr. Ashford. That's how we rebuild ourselves, one little thing at a time. Over the next few weeks, something remarkable began to happen at Ashford Industries. Richard Ashford started to change. It was subtle at first. So subtle that most employees didn't notice immediately. But Marcus noticed. He noticed when Richard started saying good morning to people in the elevator. He noticed when Richard approved a charitable donation request, instead of immediately denying it. He noticed when Richard actually paused during a meeting to ask an employee about their weekend. Jennifer was the first to comment on it, pulling Marcus aside one evening when she was working late. Is it just me? Or has Mr. Ashford been different lately? Marcus smiled, but didn't elaborate. People can surprise you sometimes. But Richard's transformation wasn't smooth or easy. There were days when he backslid, when the old coldness crept back in like a familiar coat. There were evenings when Marcus would find him in his office, staring at Emma's photograph with that same devastated expression. But the difference now was that Richard would talk about it. He would share memories of his daughter, sometimes crying, sometimes even managing a sad smile when he remembered something particularly funny. Marcus had become something unexpected, not just a janitor, but a friend. They developed a routine. Several evenings a week, Marcus would stop by Richard's office during his rounds, and they would talk, sometimes about Emma and Sarah, sometimes about Marcus's son David, sometimes about nothing important at all. Marcus would occasionally play his harmonica, teaching Richard the blues scales David had been learning before he died. Richard was terrible at it, producing more squeaks than music, but he kept trying. Then came the evening in early December that everything shifted again. Marcus arrived to find Richard's office empty, which was unusual for a Tuesday. Concerned, he asked Jennifer, who was gathering her things to leave. "Mr. Ashford left early," she said, looking worried. "He got a phone call around 4 and just left. Didn't say where he was going." He looked upset. Marcus felt a chill that had nothing to do with the December cold. He tried calling Richard's cell phone, but it went straight to voicemail. He waited in the office for an hour, then 2, growing increasingly worried. Finally, around 10 p.m., Richard returned. He looked absolutely shattered. "Mr. Ashford?" Marcus stood immediately. "What happened?" Richard walked to his desk like a man in a daze. "I went to the cemetery. First time in 10 years. He sat down heavily. "I couldn't do it before. Couldn't face their graves. But today, I needed to tell them something." "What did you need to tell them?" Marcus asked gently. "That I'm sorry for wasting 10 years, for breaking my promise to Emma, for becoming someone they wouldn't recognize." Richard looked up at Marcus, his eyes red-rimmed but clear. "And I needed to tell them that I'm going to try, really try, to live again, to honor their memory by being the person they loved, not this hollow shell I've become." Marcus felt his throat tighten. "What made you decide to go today?" Richard pulled something from his pocket, a small worn notebook. "I found this yesterday, packed away in storage. It's a journal Sarah kept. The last entry is from the day before the accident. She wrote about how Emma had asked what happened to people when they died, and Sarah told her that people live on in the memories and hearts of the people who loved them. She wrote that Emma said, 'Then Daddy has to make sure to keep laughing, because when he laughs, he looks really, really happy, and I want him to always be happy.'" Richard's voice broke on the last words, and tears streamed down his face. But this time, mixed in with the grief was something else, something that looked almost like peace. "I made a decision today," Richard said, wiping his eyes. "I'm going to change things around here. Not just my attitude, but the whole culture. I want this company to be a place where people feel valued, where they can bring their whole selves to work, where mistakes are learning opportunities instead of grounds for termination. I want to build something Emma would have been proud of." Marcus smiled broadly. "Now that sounds like a plan. But I can't do it alone," Richard continued. "I need help. I need someone who understands people, who sees their potential, who—" He looked directly at Marcus. "I know you're more than a janitor. I did some research. 20 years as a teacher, music instructor, counselor. Why are you pushing a cleaning cart instead of doing what you were meant to do?" Marcus was taken aback. "Budget cuts, retirement income wasn't enough, wrong side of 60 for most HR departments. Take your pick." "I want to create a position," Richard said firmly. "Chief Culture Officer or something. I don't care about the title. Someone who works with employees, helps them develop, creates programs for work-life balance, makes sure this place feels human. I want you for the job." Marcus laughed, genuinely surprised. "Mr. Ashford, I'm 63 years old with a resume that's all over the place. You could hire someone half my age with an MBA and fancy credentials." "I don't want credentials," Richard said intensely. "I want someone who sees people, someone who cares enough to sit with a broken man in his office and not leave until he remembers how to feel, someone who plays a harmonica because it keeps him connected to his son, someone like you. Will you at least think about it?" Marcus looked at this man who had been transformed before his eyes, from an ice-cold CEO to someone genuinely trying to reconnect with his humanity. "Yeah," he said softly. "Yeah, I'll think about it." But Richard's transformation was about to be tested in a way neither of them expected. The next morning, Richard walked into a scheduled board meeting to find the atmosphere tense. The board members, several of whom had served for over a decade, were clearly prepared for confrontation. The chairman, Harold Westbrook, a silver-haired man in his 70s, didn't waste time on pleasantries. "Richard, We need to discuss some concerning changes we've observed in your leadership lately. Richard took his seat calmly. What changes are those, Harold? You've approved 3 charity initiatives in the past month, increased employee benefits spending by 15%, and according to reports, you've been, and I quote, unusually friendly with staff. Shareholders are concerned you're losing your edge. Richard looked around the table at the faces of men and women who had profited enormously from his ruthless decade of leadership. He thought about Emma's drawing, about Sarah's journal, about Marcus's harmonica, and he realized something fundamental. He didn't care about their concerns anymore. Let me tell you all something, Richard began, his voice steady and clear. For 10 years, I've run this company with a singular focus on profit. I've cut costs, terminated people without second thoughts, and created a culture of fear. And yes, it worked. Our stock price went up. Our market share increased. On paper, we're incredibly successful. He paused, meeting each person's eyes. But I was wrong. I was operating from a place of grief and pain, and I projected that onto everyone around me. I created a company that was financially successful, but morally bankrupt, and I'm done with that. Harold's face reddened. You're having some kind of midlife crisis, and you're jeopardizing. I'm not jeopardizing anything, Richard interrupted firmly. Study after study shows that companies with positive cultures, good employee benefits, and ethical practices outperform their competitors in the long term. We're not abandoning profitability. We're building sustainable success, and if any of you can't support that vision, I'll accept your resignation effective immediately. The room fell silent. Richard Ashford had just done something unthinkable. He had challenged the board that had supported him through his coldest years. Harold stood abruptly. This is unacceptable. We'll call for a vote of no confidence. Do what you need to do, Richard said calmly. But I'm not backing down. This company is going to change, with or without this board's support. The meeting ended in chaos, with several board members storming out. But 3 members stayed behind, including Patricia Chen, the youngest board member, who had always seemed uncomfortable with Richard's harsh methods. Richard, Patricia said carefully, I think you're doing the right thing. The board has needed someone to stand up to Harold's old-school thinking for years. You have my support. Richard felt something warm spread through his chest. Gratitude, relief, hope. Thank you, Patricia. The next few weeks were turbulent. Harold and his allies launched a campaign to remove Richard from his position, painting him as emotionally unstable and dangerous to shareholder interests. The business press picked up the story, running headlines about the softening of the Ice King and speculating about whether Richard had suffered some kind of breakdown. But something unexpected happened. As word spread about Richard's proposed changes, improved benefits, mental health support for employees, ethical business practices, charitable initiatives, public opinion began to shift in his favor. Employees who had been terrified of Richard for years started speaking up, sharing stories about the changes they'd witnessed, about how the office atmosphere had improved, about how they finally felt valued as human beings instead of just cogs in a machine. A particularly powerful moment came when Jennifer gave an interview to a business magazine. Mr. Ashford used to be the scariest person I'd ever worked for, she said candidly. But in the last few months, he's become the best boss I've ever had. He remembers my name now. He asks about my family. Last week, when I made a mistake in a report, instead of yelling at me, he sat down and helped me figure out what went wrong and how to fix it. That's the kind of leader people want to work for. The story went viral, spawning dozens of similar testimonials from other Ashford Industries employees. Social media campaigns sprung up with hashtags like Humanity in Business and New Ashford. Younger shareholders, particularly those focused on ESG investing, began vocally supporting Richard's transformation. Through all of this, Marcus remained a steady presence. He had accepted Richard's job offer and was working on programs to improve company culture. But more than that, he was there as a friend when Richard doubted himself, when the pressure from the board became overwhelming, when the old grief threatened to pull him back into the darkness. One evening, as they sat in Richard's office reviewing proposals for a new employee wellness program, Richard suddenly laughed. A real, genuine laugh. Marcus looked up in surprise. What's funny? Richard shook his head, still chuckling. I was just thinking about how absurd this all is. 2 months ago, I was this emotionless robot, and now I'm fighting my own board to spend more money on employee therapy sessions. Emma would have found this hilarious. Marcus grinned. She would have been proud of you. Maybe, Richard agreed. Then his smile faded slightly. The vote is next week. Harold's convinced he has the numbers to remove me. Are you scared? Marcus asked. Richard considered the question seriously. No, he said finally. Even if they do remove me, I know I've done the right thing. I've kept my promise to Emma. I've started living again. Whatever happens next, I can live with it. That's not the Richard Ashford I met 3 months ago, Marcus observed with a warm smile. No, Richard agreed. He's gone, and good riddance. The night before the board vote, Richard couldn't sleep. He found himself in his home office at 2 a.m., looking through old photo albums he hadn't been able to open in a decade. Pictures of Emma as a baby, as a toddler, as the bright 7-year-old who had drawn that picture of their family. Pictures of Sarah, beautiful and radiant, always with that knowing smile that suggested she found humor in everything. He traced his finger over a photo of the three of them at the beach, all grinning at the camera, sand-covered and sun-kissed. Emma had insisted on building the biggest sandcastle in the world, and they had spent hours constructing an elaborate fortress with moats and towers. It had been one of the best days of his life. Richard picked up his phone and texted Marcus, "Can't sleep. Remembering the good times. Thank you for helping me find my way back to them." The response came almost immediately. "That's what friends are for. Get some rest. Tomorrow's a big day and Emma's going to be watching. Make her proud." Richard smiled, set down his phone, and for the first time in 10 years, he felt something that resembled peace. The boardroom was packed. In addition to the 12 board members, several major shareholders had requested to attend, as had members of the press. Harold Westbrook stood at the head of the table, looking confident. Richard sat calmly in his usual seat, Marcus standing quietly in the back of the room as moral support. Harold called the meeting to order with barely suppressed satisfaction. "We're here to vote on a motion of no confidence in Richard Ashford's leadership of Ashford Industries. Before we vote, I'd like to present evidence of Mr. Ashford's recent erratic behavior and poor judgment." What followed was a presentation highlighting every decision Richard had made in the past 3 months that deviated from his previous leadership style. Increased spending on employee programs, approved charitable donations, slower decision-making due to increased employee consultation, declining several lucrative deals with companies that had questionable labor practices. When Harold finished, he looked around the table triumphantly. "This man is not the leader we appointed. He's putting feelings over profits, and it's only a matter of time before it destroys everything he built." Patricia Chen raised her hand. "May I respond to that?" Harold looked annoyed but nodded. Patricia stood, pulling out her own laptop. "I've done some analysis of the actual impact of Richard's changes. In the past 3 months, employee turnover has dropped by 40%. Productivity is up 18%. Our Glassdoor rating has gone from 2.3 stars to 4.1 stars, making us more attractive to top talent. And most importantly, our stock price hasn't decreased. It's actually up 6% since Richard implemented these changes. The market likes what they're seeing." She clicked to another slide. "But here's what really matters. We've had 3 major clients specifically cite our improved company culture and ethical practices as reasons they chose to expand their contracts with us. That's $12 million in new revenue directly attributable to Richard's erratic behavior." Harold's face had gone from confident to concerned. "That's just short-term." "Actually," another board member interrupted, Robert Kim, who had been silent until now, "I've been doing my own research. Companies that invest in employee well-being and ethical practices show significantly higher long-term growth. We've been so focused on quarterly reports that we've missed the bigger picture. Richard is positioning us for sustainable success, not just quick profits." The room erupted in discussion. Harold tried to regain control, but it was clear the tide was turning. One by one, board members who had seemed aligned with Harold began asking questions, expressing second thoughts, acknowledging the data Patricia had presented. Finally, Richard stood. The room fell silent. "I'm not going to tell you that feelings are more important than profits," Richard said clearly. "That would be naive and irresponsible. But I am telling you that the two aren't mutually exclusive. For 10 years, I led this company with fear and coldness. And yes, we were successful. But we were also bleeding talent, developing a toxic reputation, and building a house of cards that would eventually collapse." He paused, looking around the room. 3 months ago, I was reminded of something I'd forgotten, that businesses are made up of people, real people with families, dreams, struggles, and potential. When you treat people like disposable resources, they perform like disposable resources. When you treat them like valued human beings, they become invested in your success. Richard's voice grew stronger. "My daughter died 10 years ago, and I died with her. I became this cold, unfeeling machine because I thought that was strength. But I was wrong. Real strength is allowing yourself to be vulnerable, to care, to build something that matters beyond just profit margins." Emma used to say that the best way to be happy was to make other people happy. I think the same applies to business. The best way to build a successful company is to create an environment where people can succeed. He looked directly at Harold. "So vote me out if you want, but know that you'll be voting out the best version of this company we've ever had the chance to become." The vote was called. One by one, Hands were raised. Harold voted for Richard's removal, along with 2 of his closest allies, but the other 9 board members, including Patricia and Robert, voted to keep Richard in his position. Harold stood abruptly, his face red with anger. "This is a mistake. You're all going to regret this." "I don't think so," Patricia said calmly. "But you're welcome to resign if you can't support the direction we're going." Harold glared at her, then at Richard, before storming out of the room. His 2 allies followed. The remaining board members sat in stunned silence for a moment before Robert started clapping. Others joined in, and soon the entire room was applauding. Richard felt his throat tighten with emotion. He looked back at Marcus, who was grinning broadly and wiping tears from his eyes. Richard smiled back, a genuine, full smile that transformed his entire face. After the meeting, as people filed out offering congratulations, Marcus approached Richard. "Your daughter was definitely watching today, and I'd bet anything she was cheering you on." Richard pulled Marcus into a hug, something that would have been unthinkable months before. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for everything, for seeing past the walls I'd built, for being patient with me, for reminding me that it's okay to be human." Marcus patted his back. "That's what friends do, my man. That's what friends do." 6 months later, Ashford Industries had undergone a remarkable transformation. The company had implemented comprehensive mental health programs, flexible work arrangements, and ethical business practices that had become a model for other corporations. The 3 board members who had left with Harold had been replaced with younger, more progressive leaders who shared Richard's vision. More importantly, the culture had changed. Employees no longer feared coming to work. They smiled in the hallways, collaborated openly, and felt safe taking creative risks. Productivity and profits had continued to rise, silencing the critics who had predicted disaster. Richard had changed too. He smiled regularly now, laughed at meetings, asked about people's families, and made time for activities outside of work. He had started playing piano again, something he hadn't done since Sarah died, and had even joined a jazz group that played at a local club on weekends. Marcus often sat in with them on harmonica, and their friendship had become one of the most important relationships in Richard's life. But the most significant change came on a sunny morning in May. Richard walked into the office carrying a large package. Jennifer looked up curiously as he passed her desk. "Morning, Jennifer. Beautiful day, isn't it?" Richard said with a warm smile. "It really is, Mr. Ashford. What's in the package? You'll see. Can you gather everyone in the main conference room in 10 minutes? All departments, if possible." Jennifer's eyes widened, but she nodded. Within minutes, word had spread, and employees began gathering in the conference room, curious and a bit nervous, despite Richard's transformation. Old habits died hard, and large all-staff meetings still triggered memories of the old days. When everyone had assembled, Richard stood at the front of the room with the package beside him. Marcus stood near the back, having been given advance notice about what was about to happen. "Thank you all for coming," Richard began. "I know some of you are probably worried. Large meetings like this used to mean layoffs or bad news, but I promise this is different." He looked around at the sea of faces, young and old, diverse and talented, all looking at him with a mixture of curiosity and cautious hope. 10 years ago, I suffered a tragedy that changed who I was. I became cold, ruthless, and cruel. I treated all of you like numbers on a spreadsheet, rather than the remarkable human beings you are. And for that, I owe you all an apology, a sincere, heartfelt apology for the years of fear and stress I caused. The room was absolutely silent. Several employees exchanged surprised glances. But about 6 months ago, someone showed me that it was possible to change. Someone reminded me that life is about more than just surviving. It's about living, connecting, and making a positive impact. That person was Marcus Webb, and I'd like him to come up here. Marcus walked to the front, looking slightly embarrassed by the attention. Richard put a hand on his shoulder. Marcus was a janitor when we met, but he was also the person who saved my life, who reminded me how to feel, who showed me that it's never too late to become who you're supposed to be. And in doing so, he's helped transform this entire company. Richard turned to the package and opened it, pulling out a large framed photograph. It showed a young girl with blonde pigtails, grinning at the camera with pure joy, holding up a drawing of a family. The room collectively held its breath, sensing the profound significance of this moment. "This is my daughter, Emma. She died when she was 7 years old, and I spent 10 years trying to bury her memory because it hurt too much to remember. But what I've learned is that the people we love don't want to be forgotten. They want to be celebrated. They want their joy and light to continue in the world." Richard's voice was thick with emotion, but he continued steadily. "So I'm announcing the Emma Ashford Memorial Fund. It will provide scholarships for children pursuing arts education, support for families dealing with loss, and grants for programs that bring joy and creativity into people's lives, because that's what Emma did. She brought joy everywhere she went. He hung the photograph on the wall behind him, positioning it carefully. This picture will hang in every Ashford Industries building, not to make anyone sad, but to remind us what really matters, to remind us that behind every employee is a full, complex life, that our work should honor the memory of those we've lost by creating something meaningful. Richard turned back to the crowd, tears streaming openly down his face, but he was smiling. Emma made me promise to keep laughing, to keep finding joy. I broke that promise for 10 years, but with Marcus's help, and with your patience and grace, I finally figured out how to keep it. The room erupted in applause. Several employees were crying, moved by the raw vulnerability of their CEO's words. Jennifer was openly sobbing, as were many others. Marcus squeezed Richard's shoulder, his own eyes wet with tears. When the applause finally died down, Richard had one more surprise. There's something else. Marcus, you've been invaluable in your role as Chief Culture Officer, but I've been thinking about that drawing I mentioned, the one Emma made that said, "Love Emma" at the bottom, and I realized something. This company needs more than just good culture. It needs heart. So I'm creating a new position, Chief Heart Officer. And Marcus, if you'll accept, I'd like you to take that role. Marcus laughed, wiping his eyes. Chief Heart Officer? That's the strangest job title I've ever heard. Maybe, Richard agreed with a grin. But can you think of anyone better qualified? Marcus looked out at the room full of employees, at the picture of Emma smiling down at them, at his friend Richard who had traveled so far from the broken man he'd met 6 months ago. Yeah, he said softly, I accept. The room erupted again, this time with cheers and laughter mixing with the tears. Employees came up one by one to thank Richard, to share their own stories of loss and recovery, to tell him how much the changes had meant to them. It went on for over an hour, and Richard stayed for every conversation, listening intently, offering comfort and encouragement. That evening, after everyone had gone home, Richard and Marcus sat in the office one last time, looking at Emma's picture now hanging prominently on the wall. You know what the crazy thing is? Richard said quietly. I thought I was honoring her memory by shutting down, by becoming this successful but soulless businessman. But really, I was dishonoring everything she stood for. Emma was all about joy, laughter, connection. She would have hated what I became. But she'd love who you are now, Marcus pointed out. You kept your promise, Richard. Maybe it took 10 years, but you got there. Richard nodded, then pulled out his phone. He scrolled to a voice memo he'd recorded earlier that day, something he'd been too afraid to listen to until now. It was from 10 years ago. Just a few weeks before the accident. He pressed play. Emma's voice filled the room, young and bright and full of life. Daddy! Daddy, tell the joke about the penguin, the one that makes you laugh so hard you snort. Then Richard's voice, so different from how he sounded now, warm, playful, alive. Okay, why don't you ever see penguins in Britain? Emma's giggling. Why? Because they're afraid of whales. The recording filled with laughter. Emma's infectious giggle, Sarah's warm chuckle, and Richard's own deep belly laugh that turned into the snort Emma had mentioned. The joy in that sound was almost unbearable. The recording ended. Richard was crying, but he was also smiling. That, he said, pointing to the phone, that's who I used to be. That's who I'm becoming again. Marcus put his harmonica to his lips and began playing What a Wonderful World again. The same song he'd been humming the first night they really talked. But this time, something unexpected happened. Richard started laughing, not the broken, bitter sound from months ago, but real, genuine laughter. It started small, just a chuckle, but it built and built until he was laughing so hard tears ran down his face. It was cathartic, cleansing, like 10 years of frozen emotion finally thawing. Marcus stopped playing, grinning widely. There it is. There's that laugh Emma wanted to hear. Richard wiped his eyes, still chuckling. You know what? I remember now. I remember what my laugh sounds like, and it sounds like home. They sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, both lost in their own thoughts. Finally, Marcus spoke. Can I tell you something I've never told anyone? He asked quietly. Richard nodded. When David was dying in those last few weeks, he made me promise something too. He said, Dad, promise me you won't stop playing music. Promise me you won't let grief kill the joy. And for a while, I kept that promise. But then things got hard financially. Life got complicated. And I drifted away from it, started taking whatever jobs I could find, convinced myself that I was too old, too tired, too broken to be the man I used to be. Marcus looked at Richard with deep emotion in his eyes. But then I met you, and helping you remember your promise helped me remember mine. You gave me back my purpose, Richard. You gave me back my heart. So really, we saved each other. Richard felt overwhelmed with gratitude for this unlikely friendship, for this man who had seen past his walls and refused to give up on him. Marcus, I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't. But I did, Marcus interrupted gently. And you did. And Emma and David and Sarah, wherever they are, I think they're pretty happy with how things turned out. Richard looked up at Emma's picture, at her joyful smile frozen in time. Hey, baby girl, he said softly. I kept my promise. It took me way too long, but I kept it. And I'm going to keep it every day for the rest of my life. I'm going to laugh, find joy, and make sure the work I do honors your memory. I love you, Emma, always and forever. Marcus quietly started packing up his things, giving Richard a moment alone with his daughter's image. As he reached the door, Richard called out, Marcus, thank you for seeing me when I couldn't see myself, for being patient, for being a friend. Marcus smiled, that warm, knowing smile that had first broken through Richard's walls. Anytime, my friend, anytime. After Marcus left, Richard stayed in the office a while longer. He thought about the journey he'd taken, from the cold, ruthless CEO who hadn't laughed in a decade to the man he was now. It hadn't been easy. There had been setbacks, moments of doubt, times when the old grief threatened to pull him back under. But with Marcus's friendship and the memory of Emma's love guiding him, he had found his way back to himself. As Richard finally prepared to leave for the night, he did something he hadn't done in 10 years. He stopped at Emma's picture, pressed his fingers to his lips, and then touched them to her smiling face. Good night, sweetheart. Daddy loves you. And with that, Richard Ashford, the man who had been known as the Ice King, who hadn't laughed in a decade, who had forgotten how to feel, walked out into the New York evening with a smile on his face and hope in his heart. The janitor had done the impossible. He had reminded a broken man how to live again. And in doing so, he had proven that sometimes the most profound changes come from the most unexpected places, and that it's never too late to remember how to laugh, to love, and to honor the promises we make to those who matter most. Emma would have been proud, and somewhere in Richard's newly awakened heart, he knew she was smiling.